However,
You are listening to the Visualizing War podcast. In each episode, we talk about representations of war in art, text, film, and music. With new guests each time, we look at how people have described or imagined war in different periods and places. And we discuss the impact which war stories have on us as individuals and societies.
Hello, my name is Alice Koenig.
And my name is Nicholas Vierter.
And we co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. On the podcast today, we're going to be talking about conflict in the digital age and the complex relationship between conflict and digital media. We're joined by Professor Della Ratta, Associate Professor of Communications and Media Studies at John Cabot University in Rome. Donatella specialises in Arabic-speaking media. She lived in Damascus from 2007 to 2011, so Syrian media became a particular area of focus for her, and especially the use made of iPhones, YouTube, and online media to document what was happening as civil protests turned to civil war from 2011 onwards. There's a lot in Donatella's work that really resonates with our interests in the Visualising War project. In particular, her work on narratives as interventions, which can shape conflict for better or worse. She has professional experience as a journalist and TV producer, and she managed the Arabic-speaking community of the international NGO Creative Commons from 2008 to 2013. Alongside her expertise in media, Donatella is interested in storytelling across different art forms. She's curated several art exhibitions and film programs on Syria and co-founded Syria Untold, an online platform for independent writers to share stories about peace and war in Syria, which might otherwise be unheard. So we're going to be asking her a bit about that, as well as the darker sides of documenting conflict in the digital age. We really are in an age of digital war, where digital technologies and media are transforming how wars are fought and experienced and reported and remembered. So it's a really important topic to dive into. Donatella, thank you very much for making time to talk to us today. Welcome to the Visualising War podcast.
hello, thanks for having me.
So Donatella, can you kick us off by giving us and our listeners a quick overview of what you think the most significant developments in media and social media have been in the last decade? So we don't need to dive into conflict straight away, but could you just talk to us about what you mean when you say we live in a networked age, and talk us through the sort of the digital revolution and how that's changed our communication habits and the role played by traditional media?
Thank you for this question. When I mention that we live in a networked age, I do mean that when I talk about Syria, of course, I do mean that the conflict has been uploaded the very moment in which people started to film it. So the conflict itself was conceived as a networked event by the mere fact that it was filmed and uploaded live. But however, since you said it's good to have an overview of the situation without necessarily mentioning war zones or crises or conflicts, I think the most interesting development in networked media for me in the last decade is precisely something that comes out from the so-called Arab Spring. So we are now in 2021, exactly 10 years after the outbreak of the Arab Springs in the Middle East. And I do think that the Arab Spring acted as a laboratory for many techniques, especially techniques of surveillance and censorship that have been adopted later on also by Western neoliberal democracies. For example, we are all familiar with these expressions of, Facebook revolution, Twitter revolution, or Web 2.0 revolutions that were mostly used in English-speaking media, so in the Western world, to define what was happening in the Middle East 10 years ago. There was an excitement for the Arab Spring being an inherently networked phenomenon. If you remember, there was this hashtag fever, the domino effect, starting by Tunisia in late 2010, and then moving on to Egypt in early 2011, and then, of course, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, Syria, etc., etc. And all these events were unfolding live on social media using, for example, hashtags, and there was an excitement, especially in Western commentators, that this phenomenon, because it was inherently driven by by the networks, by the internet, would lead necessarily to progress and democracy in places such as the Middle East, which were usually ruled by authoritarian leaders. However, as the story unfolds, we know that this is not exactly what happened, and the Arab Spring very quickly descended into a winter, a very dark winter, civil wars, chaos, distraction. The use of social media, which was so prominent in the unfolding of the protests in the first year, caught by surprise these authoritarian leaders, which would not expect the people to be so savvy in terms of using techniques. We are, of course, talking about a population that is the majority of the population in the Arab Middle East is under 35. So we are talking about a big chunk of the population being almost digital natives. So, of course, they were definitely fluent in the use of social media 10 years ago when the protest started. But so these authoritarian regimes were caught by surprise and were kind of watching the events unfolding without being able, to stop this networked fever that was taking over the entire region, and the world was watching. If you remember, the only measure that an authoritarian leader like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was able to adopt to kind of contain the protests was actually the internet shutdown for 3 days in Egypt, which in fact resulted by having the opposite effect. So to actually drive more people to hit the streets and go to Tahrir and other squares of protest. So they were completely unprepared, but I maintain that after this moment of excitement, which is 2011, it's the beginning of this incredible phenomena of revolutions, social movements, street protests that started in the Middle East, but then moved on to also New York, as we remember, Occupy Wall Street, and Indignados in Spain, and many other social protests unfolding in the entire planet in 2011. However, I do think that authoritarian regimes have learned the lesson, and not only authoritarian regimes, but corporations, in fact. This moment of freedom, which is 2011, is no longer possible 10 years after. Why? Because, social media is becoming an incredibly surveilled place. We have been now, in the context of the new unfolding Israel-Gaza conflict, we have seen that many of the most prominent social networks have been censoring tweets or posts with the hashtag of Gaza under attack or Palestine under attack, proving that in fact there is a filtering operation going on also on social media, and social media are no longer to be conceived as neutral platforms or environment in which people just interact. Social media networks are not responsible for what people are saying. But in fact, as we progress into these past decades, and as we witness also major scandals unfolding, such as Cambridge Analytica, we do know that in fact, major social media platforms are gatekeepers. And this was not so apparent in 2011. We were under the illusion that everybody is free to post whatever, to express whatever opinion. And actually, the only problem is an authoritarian regime who might end blocking the free flow of expression or imprisoning the people who are trying to express their opinions. But this is no longer the case, because we do have gatekeepers who are headquartered in our Western neoliberal democracy. So implementing processes such as filtering that are becoming now kind of mainstream and adopted not just in the crisis situation, but I'm sure everyone has heard about, Instagram, for example, censoring images of mothers breastfeeding, just because there is some nudity involved. As much as artists also have been reporting censorship coming from Instagram or Facebook when it comes to using, for example, nudity as an artistic means of expression or political parody or whatever. So we are witnessing this phenomenon of filtering also in Western neoliberal democracies. It's no longer the exceptionalism of the Arab world, but it's a practice that it's increasingly adopted also in Western neoliberal democracies, as much as, for example, content removal or deletion, which is something that Syrian activists have been experiencing since the get-go. The claims that YouTube or Facebook have, deleted, removed content go back to 2013, so 2 years after the beginning of the uprising. And Facebook and YouTube at the time responded that this content was violating community guidelines because it was too violent, because it was maybe mobilizing toward hate speech. But the question at stake is that, is someone who's documenting a civil war also part of it, So the question is quite complicated because there might be, of course, violence involved. However, when someone is reporting events unfolding on the ground that are violent events, such as what happened in Syria, they are acting as witnesses of the events unfolding. So is this violent content, or is this a content that portrays violence that is, however, enacted by a third party? So this question, grew much more important in this decade. So from 2013, we have been witnessing, and there are NGOs denouncing this, we have been witnessing a systematic censorship of the content, censorship meaning like removal of this content which is allegedly violent. So basically the social media platforms have been doing this removal, implementing this practice of removal for the past 7-8 years. And this, I'm afraid that this practice of content removal is now a practice, as I said, also for the filtering, is a practice that has been now embraced also when it comes to a less controversial context. So not necessarily something that happens in the context of a war zone or a crisis zone, but actually can be implemented also in the case of a situation that unfolds in a Western neoliberal democracy setting.
How does this situation, as far as war reporting is concerned, how does that compare to when we were still using more traditional media? Because on the one hand, I could imagine for an actual journalist, an official journalist, there are ways and means of blocking access to certain sites, so you can make sure they don't report on certain things. But at the same time, maybe they're more difficult to stop, because if you arrest a journalist after they have done their footage, then governments often get involved. So, how does this situation with access and reporting and censorship that we have in the digital age, how does that compare to the more kind of traditional media?
When it comes to networked media, as we know, everyone can be a reporter. Everyone who has a smartphone connected to the network can become a real-time witness of any event unfolding on the ground. And we have seen this not only unfolding in the context of the Arab Spring, but also more recently with George Floyd murdering. And it's a practice that has been apparent also in the case of the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of people who were passers-by ended up being witnesses, and not only witnesses, kind of like performing the role of a journalist, producing evidence that might also end up becoming a proof during trials. So this pervasiveness of the digital, it's definitely a condition that does change the game when it comes to contemporary journalism and reporting. The plus of this situation, as I just said, is pervasiveness. So there are eyes everywhere, there are cameras everywhere. And so it's much more difficult that an event stays uncovered. And this is the case of Syria, for example, because at the time when the uprising started in March 2011, very few foreign journalists in the country. And after the outbreak of the uprising, they were barred from entering the country. So the only people who were, as a matter of fact, reporting from Syria were, in fact, this improvised de facto journalists that are not trained as journalists, but are just citizens. This is why we use this expression, citizen journalists. So this is definitely a plus, because there are places such as Syria 2011 in which the only way to access the news is to have this army of untrained journalists who eventually would turn into journalists and witnesses of the events. However, I do have to stress on the negative side, of having this, kind of citizen journalists, improvised journalists replacing professional journalists. As you have mentioned, I mean, a professional journalist is also protected by an infrastructure, by an institution, meaning, there is an employer who protects them. There are trade unions, there are laws, there is a contract, there are ethics involved, and all this professional infrastructure is missing when it comes to citizen journalists. So, of course, we cannot blame these people who used to be, shopkeepers or, taxi drivers for becoming improvised journalists and lacking this professional infrastructure that a professional journalist would have. But as a matter of fact, this becomes very problematic. And again, the Arab Spring offers a very good example to underline the criticalities of citizen journalism. So, for example, in the beginning of the uprising in Syria, because of this impossibility to go to Syria and report from the ground with a professional journalist, international networks started to rely heavily on citizen journalists. And the citizen journalists who are, again, shopkeepers or taxi drivers or university students made a lot of mistakes because they did lack this professional infrastructure, ethics, deontology. So, for example, when it comes to a request this image is too blurred, I want to get a more professional shot. So sometimes they ended up staging an event in order to put the camera on the tripod, and ending up having the professional image that was requested by international networks, So, of course, unfortunately, this is something that happened a lot in the context of Syria, because also it's a long time conflict. I mean, it's something that it's basically still unfolding. So it's also the temporality of the conflict that obliges or drive or pushes people in a way to act in this very problematic way. So also there is a tendency in Western media and academia, especially 10 years ago, to celebrate the power of citizen journalism. But I think that once again, the Arab Spring provide with an example that, shows the criticalities of such a phenomenon and not just the advantages.
Yeah, everything you've said so far is this sort of extraordinary learning journey where the networked age, the hashtag phenomenon, hashtag fever, citizen journalism is something that perhaps naively people celebrated as a positive, and there are positives, but you're helping us unpick some of the incredible complexities. And you do this at much more length in your book published in 2018, Shooting the Revolution, Visual Media and Warfare in Syria. So Donatella, you've sketched this picture where citizen journalism develops. It's sort of ordinary young people with iPhones documenting protests, the urgency of the moment, inspiring people to start filming. But as you're saying, citizen journalism starts to become more of a strategy, something that then the international media get involved with, start paying for, and then the ethics and the complexities come in. And that's when content gets curated and so on. At the start of your book, Shooting the Revolution, you write, and I'm quoting here, "The non-violent Syrian uprising that turned into an armed conflict was born digital and networked from the very moment an unarmed activist used a smartphone camera to shoot while an armed man raised a gun to shoot at him." I wonder if you can just talk us through that story a bit more and pull out what you were trying to tell us with it.
Yeah, sure. So actually, this is a trope that I see in the context of Syria. I witnessed it firsthand as I was in Syria when the uprising started. I'm referring to this trope of shooting as in a double movement, which actually inspires also the title of my book. The double movement is about a protester who is unarmed, who takes the camera and starts filming because they want to bear witness of what is happening on the ground. And the moment in which they film the events, they immediately upload the footage on the internet because, as I said before, these are digital natives. The gesture is coming from people who are digital natives, who understand the internet, networked media in general as part of their daily life. The moment in which the protester shoots in order to document the violence unfolding on the ground, they are met with the counter movement coming from the sniper, for example, regime forces, jihadists, you mentioned it, armed forces in general, who shoot at them to kill them, to kind of interrupt this process of ongoing witnessing that is taking place live and streamed live onto YouTube or other platforms. So there are thousands of videos, especially in the case of Syria, that document this trope, the double shooting. There are videos in which you do not see the face of the protester, but you see the hand of the protester shaking through the footage. This is why, some people have referred to the Syrian uprising as a pixelated revolution. This is an expression used by a Lebanese artist, Rabia Mlouh, who called it the pixelated revolution, referring to the blurred frames that were produced by these unnamed protesters. The hand, of course, is shaking because these people are in fear, in deep fear and anxiety, that they want to film the protest because they want to produce evidence of what is happening. But of course, they are humans, so they are also afraid that they're going to die while they are filming. And so you see this very evidently in the footage. Again, thousands of anonymous YouTube videos have this kind of blurred frames in which the protester is trying to shoot what's happening on the ground, and at the same time they run away from the scene, and sometimes they meet their death live on camera. So the camera falls down because they are shot at by the sniper. Aesthetically speaking, again, this is also a trope that we find analyzing the YouTube footage, anonymous footage produced by protesters in Syria.
And I think this really gets us into the complex relationship between conflict and narrative, conflict and storytelling, because there you've got a new storytelling trope emerging, a new storytelling method, but also a new kind of story. And with the camera as a weapon, but that's actually shaping the conflict itself because it's creating a new enemy for the armed forces to target. So it's actually changing the direction, the focus, the emphasis of the conflict. So very, very complex relationship. Just very recently, going back to a point you raised earlier, Donatella, I saw some discussion of whether the military coup and oppression in Myanmar, which has now been documented by thousands and thousands of protesters holding their video cameras up in defiance and with incredible bravery, the footage that they've produced may end up actually supporting law cases and bringing people to justice for crimes against humanity. So you can understand the motivations that people have for wanting to document, but also the incredible risk they incur.
So, Donatella, one question I was having was whether you could tell us a bit more about where you see the origins of the digital age, where people make this step to become a sort of journalists, documenters, instead of bystanders, instead of victims in these situations. Is this partly, as far as Syria is concerned, was that a response to the lack of media reporting? Because as you were saying earlier, professional journalists were not allowed to film the conflict, or was this an affordance, so to speak, of the new technologies that we have the possibility now, so we're using it? Is there a drive in us to try and get as many kind of different perspectives on conflicts that impact us, that go kind of beyond officially sanctioned versions? So is there an element also of this kind of skepticism that we have now about official stories that are being told to us, because we're more aware of how those stories might have been manipulated?
I like the word affordance. I do think that this is actually a very nice word to catch what, at least what I think. It's definitely an affordance of the digital culture, the global digital culture overall, that if we go back to 2011, was unfolding since 2004, 2005, which is when Facebook starts. And then after that, YouTube, and then the other social media networks. There is a Californian entrepreneur, his name is Tim O'Reilly, who writes at the end of 2004 a very interesting blog post called What is Web 2.0? In which he makes the claim that the internet is changing and embracing a new kind of mindset, which is going to become also a new business model. He describes it as understanding the network as a platform in which users will eventually produce the content. And a good tech entrepreneur, in his view, would be someone who exploits the relationships that are born on these platforms and make them profitable. And that's the beginning, of the, we call it today data mining model. However, in 2004, this is really pioneering. It's the first time that someone sketches out the structure of the soon-to-be social web and participatory culture. So this participatory culture really takes over in the second half of the 2000s. If you look at YouTube tagline, broadcast yourself, it's an invitation to put yourself and your individuality at the center stage. It's the beginning of an era, which I define in the book, the me media. It is no longer a mass media that puts, for example, a nation together, as it happened for television in post-war Europe, but it's a media that emphasizes the individuality of each of us. And of course, the Arab world is no exception to this. The Arab world is very much enmeshed in this global digital media culture. And therefore, we should not think about, Syria as a backward place in which people were not, especially young people, were not being raised with this mindset. No, it's quite the opposite. They were completely, especially the digital natives, within this kind of culture. And I had witnessed this firsthand because I was heading the Arabic-speaking community for Creative Commons, which is an international NGO headquartered at the time in San Francisco, in the very same building where we had Twitter. And Creative Commons was founded by a law professor, law scholar, and activist Lawrence Lessig in 2001. Very much, translates this idea that the social web is about sharing, freely sharing content, circulating content, remixing it. So this is really, an organization that translates this first phase of excitement for the participatory web. And so at the time when I was heading this, the Arabic-speaking branch of the organization, I did witness by organizing, Geek Fest, bar camps, Arab bloggers meetings, I did witness firsthand that this youth was completely fascinated by the possibility of the new media as much as we were in the Western world. And they wanted to be part of it. They wanted to be connected with this global digital media culture. They were fluent in the language of digital media culture. They were very tech-savvy people, I have to say, especially in Syria and Palestine. There is a very fertile ground for people who work in coding, open source programming. So I want to say that definitely this is an affordance. We should not think about the Arab Middle East as an exception, But however, then I do think that the exceptional situation, which is, of course, the outbreak of the uprising and the extreme violence with which this uprising was met, unfortunately, especially in the case of Syria, did generate the need of this generation to tell the story. So in the beginning, it's definitely an affordance of global digital media culture that has shaped this youth in the Arab Middle East. But then when the uprising starts, it's definitely also the need of witnessing what is happening, because professional journalists are not allowed to come to Syria, or those who come to Syria, regardless of the ban, such as Mary Colvin, for example, are met with death unfortunately. So then after, for example, I think the Mary Colvin case is a turning point, because after seeing how brutally she was killed, deliberately targeted by the regime, then many other professional journalists, and especially their organizations, they thought, okay, this is no longer feasible, to send journalists into Syria, even, having them sneak into rebel-controlled zones. So, of course, then these youth realize that if they do not tell the story, no one would do that. So that's definitely something that happens in the case of the urgency manifested by the crisis situation in Syria.
So, Donatella, you've already said a little bit about the way in which international media organisations started paying citizen journalists that perhaps affected the kind of journalism that they were doing. I wonder if you can say a tiny bit more about how other groups, institutions, perhaps strategise citizen journalism during the Syrian conflict.
Yes, to start with, I would like to say that, again, going back to this moment of excitement for the potentials of the participatory web, everybody, scholars, journalists, analysts, were very much, I think, romanticizing this phenomenon that we call citizen journalism, by saying that, okay, this is now the time in which finally everybody can express themselves freely, can contribute to the exercise of democracy by participating into the process of newsmaking, which is finally something happening grassroots, so bottom up rather than top down, as in a previous scenario, which is the broadcast media. So this kind of narrative had been informing the reports, analysis, books that have been authored at the time. And I'm talking even before the Arab Spring, but again, going back to the mid-2000s, which is the moment in which this social web finally unfolds. So there was this narrative that was kind of romanticizing citizen journalism. But then we have to see how citizen journalism works in a real situation, especially in a crisis situation such as Syria. After the very first moments in which people are definitely driven by this desire, which is a need, to document what is happening in order to produce evidence that might help future trials in the international court, for example. So after this moment of urgency and need, there is also the moment of, from the point of view of an activist asking, how do I support myself in this situation, which is lasting not just 1 week, 1 month, or even 1 year, but years and years. So we are talking about a crisis situation, which is not only the war that is unfolding, but it's the overall crisis of people losing their jobs, losing their family members, losing their houses. So it's a material crisis in which people have to survive in a way or another. So, of course, reporting moves from a need, an ethical desire, to something else, which I would call labor. Because people, they have to sustain themselves. On the other hand, there is an increase in the demand of foreign institutions, so not just news outlets, but also NGOs, for example, or foreign governments who want to understand what is happening on the ground in Syria, because it's a very strategic place, of course, for the Middle East, for geopolitics overall. So these different subjects want to jump on the Syrian file, and so they need to recruit people because, as we said before, it's no longer possible to send your own journalists or your own reporters or your own people on the ground. So you have to recruit people among those who are already there, and also who understands the local language, the local culture. So there is a kind of, I use the expression labor not by chance. It's a matter of supply and demand. So the supply and demand are both there. There is an increase in the demand, which is met by the supply on the ground. The protesters turn into citizen journalists, turn into filmmakers who provide the demand. So the institutions, the NGOs, the news outlets with what they want to see. And This is, of course, a tricky game when it comes to a crisis situation such as Syria. But also we have to expect that such a thing happens, because it's not possible to think that people would survive a crisis situation, a war zone, without being paid for their labor. But the fact that they are paid for what they produce kind of introduces some variables, such as, again, as I mentioned before, deontology. If the demand is to have more stable footage, less pixelated footage, then how do I end up producing that? If I'm not trained as a filmmaker, as a journalist, then I would stage it, because that's probably the easiest thing to do for a person who does not have this professional background. And so this generates, of course, a big dilemma,
Maybe that's a good point to kind of delve a bit more into these positive or negative effects of citizen journalism. So you've described how the whole movement has gained enormous traction, how people are coming in also from the inside because they're interested in this. So I wonder whether, just to start with, you could talk a bit about what you see as sort of the most important positive effects of citizen journalism before we then also look at the negative aspects.
Well, definitely there is a positive effect in having more voices in a place like Syria, for example, but overall in the Arab Middle East, which is characterized, historically speaking, by authoritarian media, a system which is not possible to penetrate, as a citizen. There is no relation whatsoever between the citizen and their media. The media is just the expression, the mere expression of what power wants you to hear in a place like Syria and overall in the Arab Middle East. So definitely I see a blossoming of different point of views, expressions, and also overall creativity in the aftermath of the uprising. I myself have co-founded this media outlet called Syria Untold in 2012 with a group of Syrian and another Italian Syrian scholar. And the desire, when we founded Syria Untold back in 2012, we really wanted to express, to give a platform to untold stories, so voices coming from, example, from civil society, who we felt they would not be able to be heard through mainstream media. But as Syria Untold, there are many other Syrian outlets that have been flourishing in the aftermath of the uprising, breaking the de facto monopoly of the government in telling Syrian stories. So I think that's definitely a good outcome. And as now the majority of these outlets are based in Europe, because people who started them have been obliged to seek asylum in Europe or to escape Syria. So I think, this environment of alternative media, grassroots media is now facing a new phase, which is, okay, so what do we do now that we are out of our country? We have still to contribute to telling the story of our country, but from the diaspora perspective. And at the same time, Syrians are becoming integrated with the European societies that are hosting them, Germany, France, the UK, all the European countries who have been providing Syrians with political asylum. So it's going to be definitely an interesting phase of integration, also from a European perspective. And I think that the Syrian people have learned the lesson of, through the practice. It's not something that they have learned at school by training, but as a matter of fact, they have been trained on the ground to kind of shape a new media ecosystem which was not existing before. And I think this is a good outcome, not to mention also the artistic side, because many of those who were improvised YouTubers and filmmakers then have become professional filmmakers who have found success also in major international venues such as Venice Film Festival, Berlin Film Festival, Locarno Film Festival, So we have been hearing about Syrian documentary filmmaking, Syrian art throughout Europe and America. So I think this blossoming of creativity and free expressions is definitely a good outcome of 2011.
That's very interesting. Many positives then, partly documenting, bearing witness, perhaps providing material for courts of law, but also this explosion of different voices, breaking the monopoly of state media. But of course, not every voice out there had Syria's best interests at heart. So I wonder if we could turn perhaps to some of the more negative consequences. In your book, Shooting the Revolution, you write, Syria is the first fully developed network battleground in which the technological infrastructure supporting practices of uploading, sharing and remixing has become dramatically implicated in the production and reproduction of violence. So can you just talk us and our listeners through this in a bit more detail? What connection do you see between digital media, citizen journalism, and the production of violence?
Well, I'm referring to the fact that in a participatory web environment, everyone can be a producer of media, including violent forces. So including snipers, including jihadists, including torturers. Everybody is empowered by this technological infrastructure to produce visual media that is aiming at performing violence in a way. So, for example, in the book, I talk about not just, the peaceful protesters who have been producing images as a weapon to protect themselves from the violence that was unfolding on the ground, but also perpetrators who have tortured live on camera in order to produce aesthetic performances of that very torture. I talk about jihadis who have, and I think the most visible and famous / infamous example is, of course, ISIS. The way in which ISIS uses visual media in order to trigger violence and also to make propaganda, because this is also what they did with their videos. It's unprecedented. The way in which also ISIS has been using a participatory culture, meaning hashtags, meaning memes, for example, lolcats, the most kind of allegedly banal, mundane digital media objects have been used by terrorist organizations such as ISIS to produce more violence, and at the same time also to kind of do a very effective propaganda. Because if you remember, at the time, a lot of people, also young people from the UK, for example, Denmark, France, they actually left and went to Syria in order to join the fight, the jihad, against the regime. So, these images do something that we would define in the scholarship using Aaron Farouki, a German filmmaker and media theorist, who calls these images operational, images who no longer represent things, but mobilize towards an action. And they, in fact, become performative in that they push people to do something, to react in a way or another to what is happening. And of course, there are seminal examples coming from ISIS, such as, at the top of my mind, the live killing of the Jordanian pilot who was captured by ISIS, and then he was put in a cage and he was live burned, and using 3 different cameras, doing this live editing. From the technical point of view, this is like a great, into brackets, example of how ISIS is exploiting the power of the image to terrorize people, of course, but also to show their power, their military power, to people who would eventually join the organization. ISIS has been using the networks in a very effective way, but also less famous than ISIS. Jihadi organizations on the ground have been using, for example, YouTube as a source of crowdfunding. Many organizations have started to shoot their own videos and following, for example, also their military actions on the ground, and then asking for support using crowdfunding, which is a practice that in Western neoliberal democracies we identify as something very innocent, that artists or other people would recur to in order to support their projects. But on the ground in Syria, unfortunately, it was used by many jihadist organizations to raise funds in order to achieve their goals. Overall, this is, everybody is empowered by the networks to have their own voice, being heard. Again, going back to what we said before, broadcast yourself. The tagline of YouTube here is revelatory of a phenomenon that is pervasive. So it's not only the peaceful protester who is empowered by the networks to become a good civil servant or citizen journalist, but also the jihadis are empowered by that very same network to use it in order to produce more violence.
I guess that takes us also to an element that's very much at the heart of our project as well, which is this question of the relationship between narrative and reality. And I think you're talking about two interrelated aspects of this. One is that there's this feedback loop. So people tell these mini stories through social media, and they have a very concrete effect. It can be a positive effect. It can be also a very negative effect when it's a recruitment tool or when it's a propaganda tool. And at the same time, I think we're also delving into something very interesting, the way in which narratives and representations stop being just representations, visualizations. They're part of the conflict. They're used as weapons, or they shift the balance between attacker and attacked. As Alice was also saying earlier, new people who used to be innocent bystanders, they become targets now. And that's something I wanted to ask you a bit more about, because that's also something you talk about in your work, this connection between visibility and violence and the continuation of violence, the way in which narrative forms, sharing platforms, memes, the like economy, and so on and so forth, actually shape the conflict. So you say at one point in your book, and I'm quoting, "The networks have granted the utmost visibility and shareability to the most extreme violence." And you were just giving us a few examples of that, really. "Finally merging the physical annihilation of places with the endless online regeneration, producing a sort of on life which gets renewed every time, and content is manipulated, re-uploaded, reposted, and shared as meanings are combined and recombined in different clashing versions." So essentially, you're saying that the digital age also reenacts violence again and again, and multiplies terror and fear. It keeps the conflict alive in many ways, allows people from different ends of the spectrum to keep engaging with the conflict and keep perpetuating the conflict by engaging with the digital material. So can you say a bit more about this, and also maybe how that is probably different from past conflicts that were documented in the more traditional written accounts, news reports from the pre-digital age, traditional war photography, and so on?
Yeah, what I think is a defining aspect of these networked conflicts, Syria is one of the first examples. I mean, 2011 is one of the first examples, but I do believe that unfortunately we will have to witness more networked conflicts in the years to come. But what is a defining aspect of these networked conflicts is the dynamics of participation that they are enmeshed in, which is defined by the element of circulation. If we go back to what theorists have written about the so-called social web, Web 2.0, there is an interesting quote from a scholar, Harry Jenkins, who says, "If it doesn't spread, it's dead." His concept of spreadability refers to content that is able to travel across the different platforms, a content that does not move in Jenkins' mindset. It's a content that becomes sticky. So no matter how valuable it is from the content point of view, but the fact that this content does not become viral condemns it to extinction. So virality is and circulations are the quintessential dynamic of the social web. And this is unfortunately very true also in the context of civil wars and violent conflicts. I reframed Harry Jenkins' motto by writing that if it's dead, it spreads. You know, he used to say, if it doesn't spread, it's dead. And I say, if it's dead, it spreads, referring to the infamous examples that I have mentioned before, like ISIS, for example. The fact that the content is so much about death and violence triggers a mechanism of hyper visibility that is unfortunately unstoppable. If you remember Twitter, for example, who immediately started to sanction ISIS-related accounts, did not succeed because the very dynamic of the social web is replication by circulation, by virality. And so a jihadi website can be mirrored by anyone because the infrastructure of the social web is decentralized. So it's no longer as, in a broadcast media context in which you destroy the TV headquarter and then so the signal is gone and everything else is gone. No, you cannot do that in the context of the Web 2.0. So you shut down an ISIS-related account, an ISIS-related website, but it replicates exponentially into the mechanism of the open social web. And in fact, even if proprietary social media like Facebook, YouTube were very responsive to the request of international governments to shut down these accounts and remove the violent content, I talk about this in my book. I'm afraid that places such as the Internet archives that are born with this mindset of openness, which was fostered in the first phase of the social web, have become repositories of jihadi content, as a matter of fact. Because, it is mentality of the beginning of the social web, a mentality of laissez-faire, a mentality of liberalism, in which governments should not censor the content, in which content should flow freely. And the social web provides for the technological infrastructure for such a thing to happen, So I'm afraid that with this architecture provided by the Web 2.0, of course, there is no possibility to stop violence, as violence replicates endlessly through the different nodes defining the participatory web. And this is what I call in the book the tragedy of digital commons. And I use this expression with sadness, because I was someone who used to advocate for sharing freely. I represented Creative Commons for 5 years in the Middle East, encouraging this culture of sharing. But the tragedy of the commons, we use this expression to define, common goods on the internet that we should protect from the interference of the governments, of corporations. But I'm afraid that what happens in the case of conflicts like Syria is that those who take advantage of the openness of the web are not progressive subjects, but in this case, ISIS, for example. So virality and circulation are definitely inherent traits, features of the new networked age and of the new networked conflicts. And this is, of course, very different from previous conflicts that used to be mediatized, for example, Vietnam, or also, the Gulf War in 91, or the invasion of Iraq in 2003. However, they do lack the networked element. So they do lack this enmeshment between a technological infrastructure provided by the social web and the human fabric who supports this very infrastructure with the practice of sharing and virally spreading content. And I think this is a seminal difference between a networked conflict as Syria is, and conflicts such as Vietnam or the Gulf War, who do have media element, but do lack the features of being a networked conflict.
I'm really interested in what you say about if it's dead, it spreads, because that truth in itself isn't necessarily new. I'm thinking back to some of the ancient material that Nicholas and I are familiar with. If you think back to Homer's great epic poem, the Iliad, for example, which bits do people tend to remember? Which bits were reproduced in art again and again, in carving on vases and so on? Well, it's often the very poignant or poetic or dramatic death scenes. And we've talked to other podcast guests about all the bits of conflict that are left out of traditional storytelling, the traditional tropes of war stories. stories. So the victims on the side, the civilians, the children, and the sort of the centering of soldiers and the high stakes drama. So the idea that, if it's dead, it spreads isn't new in itself. But what you've just explored is this sort of the incredible power that the new digital media have to take that to another level in very destructive ways. And as you say, it's something that we must have on our horizon as we think about the power of war stories, the power of storytelling and narrating and describing conflict in this new age that we're still kind of getting to grips with. And of course, one of the things that the digital age does as well is it sort of shatters geographical limitations and boundaries, doesn't it? And I think you talk about that a little bit in your book as well. Syria as a geographical space and as a political entity is almost annihilated by the digital reporting on the conflict, not just by the conflict itself. And similarly, Daesh it becomes a kind of globally embracing entity that's not sort of limited or located in purely physical space. I wonder if you could say a tiny bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. When I speak about network conflict, I refer to several, features that identify contemporary networks, and one of them is definitely this virtuality. That it's no longer in a network. The structure is no longer important where something or someone is physically located, as much as they can replicate themselves endlessly over this networked structure. So for example, in the case of Daesh, which is the Arabic name of ISIS, Daesh has characterized itself its strategy in a very different way from previous jihadi organization, namely Al-Qaeda, for example, which is probably the most famous one before ISIS in the Western world. Daesh has, on the one hand, aimed at establishing a caliphate on the ground, which they did for a short period of time, in Mosul and then in Raqqa in Syria. So on the one hand, does have this instance of being physically located somewhere. However, the media power has definitely, the media power that ISIS has shown throughout their infamous action, and I have previously mentioned some of them, it's definitely uncomparable. It's acting on a much wider global scale as opposed to the establishment of a physical caliphate, which is located in Syria or Iraq. I'm sure you remember discussions about whether the military power of ISIS has probably been overestimated by us, Western commentators, because we were mesmerized by their media power. And I do think this is actually a point, that we have definitely overestimated ISIS because we thought, oh my God, this organization is so powerful because they show all these media instances, so they should be powerful also on the ground. But actually, the real capacity of ISIS on the ground has never been proven. I mean, besides, of course, occupying some territories, but the media outreach that ISIS put into place is definitely something unprecedented, even compared to Al-Qaeda, And the difference is, of course, that Al-Qaeda was a top-down structure, Everyone remembers Bin Laden speaking to the entire world through Al Jazeera. Bin Laden did need Al Jazeera in order to have Al-Qaeda's message spread globally. There was no other way. But ISIS does no longer need Al Jazeera. In fact, if you go back to the reports about ISIS, Al Jazeera is never mentioned, because ISIS does not need any top-down organization to spread their messages. Their power lies in the unknown spreader, which is any of us. Anyone who has a social media account can perform a jihad. Actually, there is a very interesting document produced by ISIS, allegedly, called, I translate in English, Media Men, You Are a Fighter Too, in which they tell people, no matter what you do, even the smallest act of social media reproduction, such as retweeting a jihadi content, it's still a jihadi act. So please do it. This was the message back in 2015. So you do not need to come physically to Syria or Iraq in order to perform jihad. You can do it through your daily social media activity. So I think this is a very powerful yet worrisome, of course, message. And ISIS was at the time very successful in implementing this double strategy of having a physical caliphate located in the Levant, but also being much more powerful at a global level through their media structure.
That actually squares quite nicely with something we've been talking about also with other guests, that we have to shift the focus away from the concrete battle on the ground in order to assess the importance or the sort of the success of a war. One of the other interviews that will air later this year is with Phillips O'Brien, who studies grand strategy, and he says battles don't win wars. It's everything around this that wins the war. And I think you're absolutely right to say that we have to be careful about this digital war that's going on through retweeting, the circulation of contents, because, well, it might lead to other terror attacks, but it might also just lead to a spreading of ideas that in the long run will have a very negative effect on our idea of democracy and our idea of civil liberties that are important to us. What I'm wondering is, what about these citizen journalists themselves? So obviously they've been engaging with digital media to deal with physical violence, physical objects, a situation on the ground. Have they adapted also to react to the fight that's going on in the social media? Are they reacting to this as well to try and put up resistance against that, the way in which social media itself becomes a theater of war, so to speak?
Well, I'm afraid that now in the context of Syria, I mean, most of the citizen journalists who used to be very active in the very first years after the uprising have now left for safer places, namely Europe, or unfortunately, many of them have been killed or imprisoned by the regime. So I would say there is not such a thing as citizen journalism now on the ground. I mean, very few examples. The battle, I think, now has shifted to the digital domain. I did mention previously the fact that all these grassroots outlets that have been blossoming as an effect of the 2011 uprising are now located in Europe, and so they are now facing different challenges. So no longer, facing oppression and repression by an authoritarian regime, but having, for example, to integrate or to tell about the possible integration with these new European societies, issues such as citizenship, racism, equal treatment. I mean, these are becoming important for these grassroots outlets. So this has shifted in a way, but I also do want to mention, since you said something that really resonates also with my work, which is that we should not only assess a conflict in its physical dimension, but we should also take a good look at what is happening in the domain of the digital, which is no longer the domain of the virtual, as we used to call it in the 90s, but has become enmeshed with our daily life. So it is as real as the physical domain in which we live. So definitely the digital has become a battlefield, and some of the most savvy, smartest Syrian activists have understood this, and they're now fighting their next battle in the domain of the digital. And namely, the next battle is to restore or revive the content that has been deleted by corporate capitalism, which I mentioned before. So many proprietary platforms have deleted content that was, in the eyes of Syrian citizen journalists, important to tell the story of Syria in 2011. So now there are organizations such as the Syrian Archive. I think this is the most prominent one, based in Berlin. The Syrian Archive is working as an open source repository to store digital evidence, because this is what it is today, evidence for also future generation to tell the story of Syria. So not necessarily evidence in a trial, but also as part of a history that would otherwise be missing had corporate capitalism won the battle, definitely, by deleting all this allegedly violent content from their premises. So the Syrian Archive is doing a great job advocating for this content to be a seminal, important part of the history of Syria from 2011 on. And they're also providing digital evidence to many trials that are happening, for example, in Germany these days. So I think it's important to mention that Syrian activists have become aware of how important the digital domain is in the battlefield, in future conflicts.
And as you're saying there, it's important in a sort of a live situation, important in driving or perhaps mitigating violence at the time. But what you've just been saying about the Syrian archive, for example, and these issues of deletion, archiving, who gets to decide what's kept, who gets to decide what goes, that suggests that there's a battle over the history of the digital domain as well. So battles to be fought in the future over control of our documenting of the past. Do you feel optimistic about this? You've got lots of experience with Creative Commons. You talked earlier about how positive you had been at the start. We've seen how complex it is and how easy it is actually to get disillusioned and feel very anxious about that. But do you feel optimistic that we are coming up with solutions, that things like the Syrian archive will proliferate and that we will sort this out?
To quote an Italian philosopher who I really like, Antonio Gramsci, he used to say, I am pessimistic with the reason and optimistic by will. So if I have to assess the situation analytically only, I would be quite pessimistic. Why? Because the social web, as it is structured today, is mainly a private place. It is definitely managed by corporations. Most of them are in Silicon Valley, but not only. Now we are seeing the rise of China in the social media game with the TikTok, for example, and more to come for sure. So I don't think it's good news also that an authoritarian regime such as China is entering the digital game in such a successful way. And we know how successful TikTok is in the Western world, actually. So if I have to assess the way in which the social web today in 2021 is configured, then I definitely to be pessimistic, because there are very, very few places that are left to the so-called commons. Probably 99% of the social media game, which is a big chunk of the internet-related business today, is controlled by private corporations. And the problem with private corporations is accountability. So they can do whatever they want because it's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. These are private spaces. We are misled in that we understand them as also public spaces, part of the so-called public sphere. But in fact, they are not. They are privately owned and controlled by these corporations, which sometimes equals just one person, as in the case of Instagram and Facebook. So that's definitely worrisome for the future of democracy. I think we should look very seriously at what is happening with the reconfiguration of the social web. And we should, when I say we, citizens and governments, especially in Europe, find ways to put some more constraints on the absolute power that these corporations are manifesting. Otherwise, we really risk to become, all of us, like the Syrian activists who are now fighting for defining their own history. Because also in the future, we might find a similar challenge. And there is definitely a need of governance process and accountability that should be implemented. However, I also have to be optimistic with the will, taking Syria as an example, and I was previously mentioning the Syrian archive. So these smart kids have realized that in fact the next battle is going to be on the digital, and they are implementing platforms and tools in order to protect themselves from this uber power of the corporations. So I do believe that we still, as individuals, as citizens, have the power to counteract, but we should act in a timely manner, because it's like these 10 years, I think we have been sleeping a little bit, because as I said before, there was a first moment of total excitement about what was happening in the Middle East. And then immediately this moment of excitement became anxiety and fear and desperation, because actually the Arab Spring was failing and becoming an Arab winter. But then we did not realize that these processes that had been tried out in the context of the Arab Spring could become something much bigger, much more global, which is what is happening, actually, what has been happening in the last decade. So I think it's time now for a wake-up call for all of us to realize that there are some affordances, again, of the social web as it is that should be looked at with concern, also by us living in comfort zones or Western neoliberal democracies.
Because as you were saying, boundaries and frontiers, they don't really apply in the same way to what we're talking about here as they do on the ground, or as they used to. Is this also where your own activism comes in, Donatella, with the Syria Untold website?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as I mentioned before, Syria Untold was founded in 2012, so very early in the unfolding of the uprising, because we did kind of realize, or we had this gut feeling that at some point, Syrian civil society would disappear from the frame. So we needed to do something in order to protect it, or at least to have their voices heard. And this is what we are trying to do as the organization Syria Untold moves to a new phase, which is, again, becoming more institutional, because now, again, I not by chance, I use the word organization, because it's now an NGO headquartered in Berlin. So we have kind of institutionalized something that was in the beginning a grassroots project. And if you look at the website, which has also an English version, we try to give room to also artistic expressions such as photography, cinema, but also to communities that have been discriminated a lot in the context of the authoritarian Middle East, such as LGBTQ plus communities. So we are trying to, with our own project, to give some visibility to these expressions and voices that are unfortunately not heard in mainstream outlets.
And you mentioned earlier the way in which some of the citizen journalism has actually translated into film, and there's been a sort of the emergence of a thriving film industry in Syria. So I'm thinking of films like For Summer, or Houses Without Doors, or Silvered Water. Can you just talk us through a little bit about how that citizen journalism ended up becoming a bit more of a film industry? I'm interested partly because I think it's a film industry that actually has a huge potential to impact on, more generally, on filmic representations of war. It's some of the representation, the live witnessing, almost the documentary nature of it. Is it a really interesting counterbalance to some of the narratives of war that we see on screen?
Yeah, so we have to differentiate actually products that come from already established filmmakers from products that have been produced in the aftermath of the 2011 uprising by newcomers to the field, who were in the beginning videographers or citizen journalists who eventually transitioned into something like professional filmmaking. So I'm thinking, for example, about the difference between a filmmaker such as Osama Mohammed, who is the co-director of Silvered Water, a very interesting documentary, which was also compiled partially by Osama, who at the time already sat in exile in Paris, by editing anonymous footage which was found on YouTube in the first year of the uprising. This film has been compared a lot to, Godard kind of film essays, bears a lot of reflection over what is happening on the ground in Syria, but also what is happening on the networks. Because, as I said, a strong component of the film is the editing of anonymous footage that Osama found on YouTube. But that's definitely a work that comes from a professional, established Syrian filmmaker. And of course, we have to differentiate it from work such as even Houses Without Doors, or you mentioned For Sama. So these are products that emerge from this new wave of documentary filmmaking that erupts in the aftermath of the 2011 uprising. And their makers are not professionally trained directors, but are just people who ended up documenting the event as a matter of fact, them being, for example, activists on the ground or civil servants or university students, but they don't have this professional background that someone like Osama Mohammed has. So this new generation is definitely very interesting. We are talking about people who are in their now 30s, more or less, early 30s. And they have been quite well received in international venues. For some, I also went to the Oscars, like Houses Without Doors also was awarded, and many other films were awarded in major European venues mostly. I think what is interesting now to see is the way in which this approach to filmmaking will be changed by the fact that these people are now living in Europe, so they can no longer produce that kind of instant cinema that characterized their first feature films. So it's now time to see what this new generation of filmmakers will do in the context of a more, let's call it, stable situation in which they live in Europe as citizens. So what kind of stories are they going to tell? Are they still going to tell stories related to Syria in a way? Or are they going to transition into something, I don't know, completely unrelated? This is yet to come because, as I said, this generation so far has produced films that are still related to the post-uprising context because they were still, in a way, working in Syria or living in the region. But now what happens when these people become, in fact, European citizens?
So now, Donatella, in a way, we're already talking about possible future developments, and that's a perfect cue also for a question that I have for you before we let you go. So could you tell us maybe a bit about what kind of lessons you think the media revolution around the Syrian conflict has to teach us about conflict and visualizing conflict in the future?
Well, as I said before, I think the most important lesson for me personally is that we have to think about what happened in Syria as not only related to Syria. In this book, which I co-edited with Sune Ogbole and Kay Dickinson, called The Arab Archive, I have a piece called Why Syria is no longer only about Syria. So I think we have to think about conflicts not as exceptions, but as events that are establishing our daily routine in a way, our normalcy. Again, the dynamics of the social web that emerged because of the Syrian conflict have now manifested as dynamics that are inherently attached to the way in which contemporary networked media function. So what happened in Syria sheds light on the fact that these are not flaws of the system, but they are in fact features of the system. The inherent violence of outmost circulation is not an accident that manifests itself in the Syrian context because it's a war context, but in fact, it is a feature that defines the very structure of the social web as it is conceived now. So we have to stop thinking about conflict, material conflicts such as Syria, as exceptions, because we live in a society that is now characterized by total conflict. And even what we are living these days with the virus, it's a kind of war. Many people have actually used this metaphor to define it. So the new civil war is no longer a war that is necessarily fought on the ground, but it's a more pervasive condition. And so I think we have to realize it. Pier Paolo Pasolini, an Italian writer and filmmaker, used to say, we are surrounded by violence, and the violence very soon will become the utmost condition of postmodernity. And I think it was right. He was aware. He said, now I am living a very risky life, so I take responsibility over the violence that I might have to face. And this was quite prophetic because he was killed the day after. However, he underlined, very soon violence will become a condition of society, no longer an individual condition, but a condition that it's more, as I said before, pervasive. So I think that what I learned from the Syrian situation is exactly this, that violence is becoming, as in Pasolini's word, a pervasive condition of postmodernity that not necessarily manifests itself in open fighting, like in Syria, but it's part of our daily life. So we have to realize that the media that translates our postmodern condition, which is, this networked environment in which we live and learn and love, we do pretty much everything, especially after the pandemic. So this is becoming increasingly our environment, and we have really to be careful about what kind of infrastructure stays underneath this environment, because as I said, I do believe that what Syria reveals is a dynamic that is by far not a flaw of the system, but in fact a feature of the corporate sharing economy as it is conceived today.
So on the one hand, exciting new ideas, developments, social, cultural, aesthetic to look forward to, but also enormous challenges that come with this, and that we should all be aware, and especially in the digital age, not think things that happen in Syria really don't have that much to do with us, or because they're physically separate. Those ideas of the primacy of the physical presence are really kind of slowly eroded, I think, in the times that we live now, with the digital infrastructure that we have that, as you say, sort of underpins everything. Donatella, thank you so very much for this fascinating discussion. It's been absolutely great to learn so much about citizen journalism, conflict reporting, done not by professionals, the role of the digital age, the chances and the risks and challenges involved in this. So thank you for coming to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. This was a very inspiring discussion, and I look forward to actually maybe re-listening to it, because there are lots of ideas that we have been touching upon. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you very much from me as well, Donatella. You've really shone a spotlight on the very complex and close relationship between storytelling and conflict. That example you gave of the possibility to actually carry out an act of jihad by telling a story and retweeting or sharing a narrative is a really good way of exemplifying that tight relationship, which is what our project is very interested in. So thank you for joining us for that extraordinary tour of digital war. We hope that you, our listeners, have enjoyed this conversation as much as we have with Professor Donatella Della Ratta. Thank you for listening, and please tune in again next week when we'll be staying with the topic of digital war, digital reporting and conflict. Our guest will be Dr. Omar Mohammed, otherwise known as the Mosul Eye. A historian by training, Dr. Mohammed lived through ISIS's occupation of Mosul in 2014 and began a blog about it to document his experiences and also to counter some of the rumors that were rife. He continued to post updates throughout the occupation and liberation of the city, and today he uses his platform to promote healing and reconciliation. So we're going to be talking to him about that and about the use of images of peace and reconstruction to visualize life beyond conflict.
So do join us for that. And if you would like to support our project, please do share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, because that really helps people find the show. And if you would like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualizing War, or get in touch with us directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk.
Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zofia Gertin. Thank you very much for listening.